The review is based on 3 background documents that are submitted to it. One is a compilation of reports that the UN pulls together from all the special rapporteur visits, every other official visit that they've had from their special procedures, and they're pulling together a 10-page report on recommendations made from that. There's another report that our government is writing, and that one's going to be submitted in August 23rd is when they're saying they're going to submit that. So put that on your calendars and be paying attention for when that comes out so you can read what our government says the human rights record of the United States is, so that we can say, I think that part needs a little correction there, sir. Yes?
Is there any way to get involved in that or find out what they're doing while they're doing it? Or
we've been trying to talk with them and see if we can have some input on the process, or we've asked for them to show us a draft of their report, and so that we can critique it and send it back. They've said there's no way that we're going to show you a draft of our report, but we're in touch with the people that are drafting the outline of it, and we're trying to talk with them and help make sure they at least have the issues listed. What we've heard that they're planning on doing is their report gets to be 20 pages long, so they're planning on having addressing 20 different issues, specific issues, and having 1 page per issue. So we at least want to make sure that the touchstone issues that we've been seeing raised across the country are getting a page in that report, and that they're hearing what we actually were saying. They came out and tried to hear what we were saying at one point, and we're going to talk about that and what happened there. And so we have the UN's report, our government's report, and then we have our report. The civil society, they call them stakeholders, anyone that has a hand in what's going on with human rights in the United States. So everyone in this room had the chance to write reports, and those are due in April, and we're going to be talking a little more in depth about those soon. So that's what the review is based on. In November, we don't get to ask questions, but other governments do. So we're going to be talking to the representatives of other governments to try and make sure they're asking the right questions. And then once the report's there, we have this official document, and we're going to have to follow up on it and see what our government said and try and enact changes on what their report actually said. So that's the basics of the UPR process.
A great segue into what I want to talk about, which is the lobbying process. Some years ago, Malcolm X challenged us, activists in this country, to move the civil rights movement to the human rights movement, and one of the steps in that process was to take the United States to the United Nations and to point out to the world the inconsistencies and the standards that it claimed to hold dear and to practice as compared with what it did actually. The Universal Periodic Review process is championed as a non-confrontational process, and it, as such, therefore allows for us to ask a great many questions of a great many people in a great many different kinds of ways, to which they are required and forced to respond because it is non-confrontational, and they would appear to be very passive-aggressive or hostile if they fail to respond. It's an especially useful tool in light of the fact of having the first African-American president and the tension that many people feel about holding the first African-American president accountable for human rights standards. And the reports that we have, the 24 reports that we have submitted to the UPR process, for the UPR process, we raise what are very, indeed, actually traditional questions about weaknesses in the United States' educational system, health care, access and delivery systems, the legal system, labor rights, broad spectrum of activities that impact us all on a day-to-day basis. The process for lobbying is the same for the UN Human Rights Council as it is for any other entity for which we would be lobbying, whether we're talking about Congress or we're talking about our state legislatures. How many of you have been involved in any kind of formal or informal lobbying? Great, great. And as we all know, that the first thing that we do is we pick our target. We identify those potential listeners and actors who are likely to be sympathetic to us. Fortunately, we have with the Universal Periodic Review a website, and I would urge you to note it and to take a look at it. It's upr.org.
UPR?
UPR info?
I'm sorry, uprinfo.org. Thank you.
No, but
So
no dot.
UPR dash, so a hyphen info.org.
Which helps and which we use to help us to identify countries that will raise questions and advance recommendations that we propose in order to, because it's in their interest as well as our own. I think someone mentioned earlier that non-governmental organizations do not speak at the review. However, we attempt to do so indirectly through countries which do speak. It's structured so that you have what's called a troika.
When we first met with the State Department, they had planned to use these consultative meetings as part of, quite frankly, a propaganda ploy to use to demonstrate to other members on the Human Rights Council how engaged they were supposed to be with civil society. But it wasn't intended to be real. In fact, when they first talked about it, they called it, in fact, a road show. And they had picked out like 10 different cities that they're going to hit in a matter of like, what, 2.5 weeks or something at first? And then what they tried to do was, because they didn't really know what was happening in the field over the last 5-6 years in terms of human rights, they thought they were going to get in contact with some of their, with certain friends, some of the usual suspects, and set up a little phony meeting and go through and have a quick meeting and hit the next city. Well, when they started doing that, they discovered, and we in the meeting now, we were very gracious, and we said, look, we want to work with you to make the consultations real. And they said, okay, we'll do that. But they had another plan, and we knew that. But what they didn't know was how organized we are now in this country in terms of human rights. So when they went to, and when they tried to kind of go around us and went to some of their old friends, even some of their old friends, some of the usual suspects, are part of this network. And even though some of them might have wanted to go ahead and take the lead and pretend to be the group to work with, they knew they had to be accountable to a different kind of body, that is this network they're part of. So they had to steer the State Department back to what we were trying to put in place in terms of we had a volunteer steering committee from across the country that was in fact coordinating this UPR process. So they got turned back. It happened about 4 or 5 times until they finally realized that if there's going to be consultative meetings, they had to be real. They couldn't fly in and just, throw something together with folks. And they finally decided to take it seriously. They jettisoned their schedule and they put in place a schedule that made some degree of sense. They gave us on the ground some time to get organized in order to have a real consultative meeting.
One of the ways our government decided that they were going to try to get in front of this process, maybe that's the way to frame it, is by setting up these consultations where they would have 4 major departments from the federal government come out to, I believe there were 12 consultations in total. I may be off about the number, 10 to 12. They would send out the Department of State would head up the process, along with the Department of Education, HUD, and the Department of Justice. So these groups in February 26th, the last Friday in February, they came to New York City. It was a process. They engaged Columbia Law School to set up this process, and I was asked by members of the U.S. Human Rights Network to facilitate the housing piece of that program, and then at the last moment to facilitate the entire day. So I thought it worked for me. I have no problems with it because it gave me an opportunity, coming off the work that I did with the rapporteur, to really push high-level elected officials who are going to be in the room. And if they're for real about this process, here's an opportunity for me to challenge them to see how far, number one, you could push these elected officials to do or to follow these doctrines, and see what they were going to do about the universal periodic review process. So with the housing piece, I opened up with a pretty strong relationship type of speech, talking about the work I do with folks like in LA, folks in Chicago, folks in Atlanta, to let HUD know that we are working together in this country to elevate housing to a human right. It's just not folks in New York talking about this issue, but there's a connection. And I think being able to engage folks like the Urban Justice Center, where Tatiana works, Asian DK, did the education piece, if I'm correct.
No, the human right to decent work.
The human right to work, I apologize. But just having a relationship with the different groups that were facilitated, the education piece, the criminal justice piece in the room, and let them know that folks are building a strong movement to elevate housing to a human right. We ended the day in a pretty particular good way. It was a snowstorm in New York on that day. There was about 12 inches of snow on the ground, and I really thought that they weren't going to come. But I got a call about 3:30 the day before to say everybody would be on Amtrak and that they would be there. And it just really gave me a chance to fuel up and say, okay, I'm really going to challenge them. We organized a site visit for housing, which I thought was particularly good because in New York City we had the highest concentration of public housing in the country. You know, multi-story buildings, 25-story buildings, and some of these buildings are suffering from systemic disinvestment that has happened over the last 30 years, and people are living in relative squalor. And having a relationship with a lot of these folks, I said, okay, I want to bring them up into a public housing unit. I want to see if they really want to be challenged, because I'm going to show them the worst of the worst. I'm going to show them where people are living. And I took them into the grant projects in Harlem, and I was surprised that they went through it. But I showed them how people are living in squalor, living in molded and affected buildings. And I think it got to the HUD lady to a point where she and I have been having a lot of dialogue lately. But I think some of that dialogue is being defensive, so I push her out to groups like the Housing Justice Movement, people doing this work in a way. These are the members that you need to be talking to, not to me. You need to be engaging the National Alliance of HUD tenants and those different groups that are working on housing. But I just wanted to let her know that we are connected and we are talking to one another about these issues, and every opportunity we get, we put them in front of you. But I think where I really was able to push the envelope is knowing that they're going to go around the country to these other cities and having a relationship with the folks in the other cities that did the rapporteur visit. I'm going to work in each one of those cities to make a telephone call and get with those organizations that I know worked on the rapporteur visit, so that they put the same situations in front of it that all these rapporteurs had seen in the past. So I made a call out to LA Can, and they got the folks, knowing that the visit was going to San Francisco, they called their friends in RAP, which is a Western Alliance of Housing Organizations, to sort of get the word out so that people get engaged in the process. Same thing happened in Chicago, New Orleans, and some of these other cities. But I think you have to show those connections and let the federal government know that we're working together. We're working as a strong movement to put these issues out in front and raise housing to a human right, education to a human right, working to a human right, and the criminal justice issue we're not going to stand for anymore. And these are the ways we have to take advantage of all of these opportunities. That consultation process was a good start for us in New York, but also to work with our friends and our allies around the country. So.